Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 6 of my 4th video game generation retrospective. Part 1 was on the generation as a whole, part 2 was on the TurboGrafx-16, part 3 was on the Sega Genesis, aka the Sega Mega Drive, part 4 was on the Sega CD, part 5 was on the Sega 32X, and part 6 is on our friend here, the Super Nintendo, also known as the Super Famicom in Japan. Now, this console launched in 1990 in Japan as the Super Famicom. Now, you'll have to ignore this bottom part, we'll talk about it in a bit. And it launched a year later in 1991 in Europe and in North America. Now, ignoring that thing on the bottom and ignoring, of course, the Super Nintendo Junior, the first thing that comes to mind is one of these things is not like the other. I mean, the European and Japanese design is the same, other than a couple of cosmetic changes in the wording, namely that this one says Super Nintendo, this one says Super Famicom, and this one says this is a PAL version, and this you're only supposed to use Super Famicom games. They're the same. Externally, the internal part is different, of course. But what the hell happened over here? There's a couple of there's two versions of how this potentially came to be. One is a very simple explanation, the other is kind of a conspiracy. So the simple answer is that Nintendo of America went, Americans like big blocky things, just give them that. Maybe? The conspiracy theory behind this is that the Famicom, as we know as the NES over here, was successful in Japan, but was a much different looking machine and was a very functional machine because it was a top-load device. So they didn't really have any problems with the games being read. In Europe, the NES, they got the same version of the NES that we did, but in Europe the console wasn't really that successful. So what that means is that less people had it and therefore less people were critiquing it. But in North America, the NES was retardedly popular. And of course that meant a lot of people were noticing the 72-pin design flaw, because that console used that weird front insertion thing that didn't really work very well. Now Nintendo's explanation for this was, oh, well, you guys keep putting your sodas and drinks on top of the console and you're spilling and it's getting inside and it's damaging the unit. In essence, not taking responsibility for the flaw. So supposedly, if you believe that story, the reason they did this was because you can't sit a soda can on it. I mean, I'm an American, I know we're kind of dumb, but I don't think we'd actually do that. I don't think we'd all be like, that's where my drink goes! Like, I don't think that I know anyone would have ever done that. Because you could put a soda can on top of these, but you can't really do that here. If that story's true, it makes sense, you can't really do that. I don't know which I personally subscribe to. It could go either way, or it could be a third option, or something else happened, I don't know. Those are the two I've heard. Now, of course, there's the Super Nintendo Junior here, which you see, which came out in like 1997 as a budget console. It wasn't around for very long, but I just thought I would show it to you guys. Now, the history with this thing is essentially that, like I said, came out in 1990 in Japan, and that's 2 years after the Mega Drive came out in Japan. In 1991 it came out in North America and Europe, which was 2 years after the Genesis and Mega Drive came out in Europe. Now, of course, they wanted to compete with Sega, because Sega was actually starting to kick their ass, and so Nintendo needed to move on. But of course, coming out 2 years later meant they had all sorts of technical advantages in their console. Which meant you'd get things like superior multiplats. Not in every instance, of course, but in a lot of cases, the Super Nintendo version of a game was better just because the console was offering you more abilities. Now, you have to respect this generation, because those two consoles in particular, which really defined the most iconic console war of all time, the only way they could really battle each other was through games. I mean, there wasn't really that many bonus features you could do to entice people to your specific console. And of course, because they were dedicated game companies, that's all they did, man. Nintendo and Sega just head-to-head, just going nuts, just trying to beat each other with games, which is really very cool. And of course, because of the time frame it was in, they didn't have things like patches and DLC to make the game further appealing or to fix it later. You couldn't pull an Assassin's Creed Unity, put it out at the holiday and patch the game later and make it tolerable then. The games had to come out and they had to be done, and that is fucking cool. Now, yes, so they primarily focused on games, but it wasn't like they didn't try other tactics. One of the other tactics they did was, physical upgrades. Now, of course, Sega was more notorious for this. They put in the Sega CD so that the console would then be at the same level as the Super Nintendo and have advantages over it. Now, Nintendo didn't quite go as nuts with that as Sega did, but Nintendo did make other efforts. which is kind of why you see this thing down here. And of course why the SNES CD almost came into existence. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. That will be discussed in the Philips CDI video, but I'm really looking forward to that because that is a fun story. But one of the other things Sega did was they created the Sega Channel. Now the Sega Channel, I talked about this in the Genesis video, but the Sega Channel in short was an online service for the Genesis where you would connect to a server and it would have a whole host of games and you could download the games and just play them that way, as opposed to having to go out and buy cartridges. Now, Nintendo was like, shit, that's a pretty good idea. How do we compete with that and compete with the Sega CD and, you know, so on. You know, Sega's doing a lot of really cool stuff. So in Japan, they came up with an answer. Enter this, the Satellaview box, or Satellaview, whatever you prefer to call it. This is an add-on only released in Japan for the Super Famicom, hence its shape. Now this is a pretty neat add-on. It was also, of course, there to kind of hold you over until the eventual Super Nintendo CD was supposed to come, but obviously never did. Now, this thing was unique. It had online capabilities, but not really the way we think of it now. It would connect and it would connect through like a service in Japan that was kind of like through a television network. And this is really hard to make much sense out of. But essentially, your online capabilities were timed. So you would get this cartridge that was the operating software called BSX. And you just, you know, pop it in there. And it would have like this little memory card and stuff I don't have. And you would connect online, and once you turn the game on, you see that you're this little character inside of a town. And you go to different buildings in the town, and the buildings do different things. One such example would be there was a building that would represent radio broadcasts. Now what you could do is you could actually go at a certain time of the day, in real life in Japan, connect to the radio part, and listen to like a radio play that was actually being broadcast live in Japan exclusively for this machine, which is really weird. They would also have a game time that was specifically unique and games made just for this. So you'd go to like a little building in the town, and you'd go to the game part, and then it would say, okay, here's the game, and this is how much time you have to play it. And that was really quite cool. And Nintendo wanted to push this thing, so they actually made games just for it. Games that a lot of people don't know actually ever existed. For example, F-Zero 2. There was also a 16-bit remake of the original Legend of Zelda for the NES on this thing. Granted, you didn't play as Link, you played as like the little host character that's in the operating system, but I guess since then, fortunately, ROM hacks have come out, people have got those out there, you know, so you can play it that way if you really want to. But there was a lot of games made for this thing that frankly are completely lost to history. There was also additional features in those games that only worked when you were playing it online at the specific time slot that it was supposed to be on. For example, some of the games would have, there would be actually some dude in an office somewhere in Japan in a radio booth or whatever saying something, and you would hear it through the game, and it was actually relevant to that moment of the game, which is crazy. Now, that doesn't exist anymore. You can't get back online, unfortunately. It's a neat little accessory. I actually, funny thing, I never had one before. I got this today. The day I am filming this video, this arrived in the mail. I got it specifically for this video, so I hope you guys enjoy the video, and please share it around because this was not fun to buy. Anyway, so it is a neat accessory, but it's mostly useless now. But it did one thing very right that Sega never figured out, unfortunately, which is that it really only requires one power supply. I know, amazing. So the way that worked is technically both the Super Famicom and the Satellaview both require a power supply, but rather than making you use two cables, they gave you this little L device, which is badly yellowed up. I'm going to have to restore that. And you plug it into the back of both devices, just like this. It snaps in right there. And then this thing came with its own power supply. And you plug it into there, and that would power both of them. And it was just a standard two-prong power supply at the end. It wasn't one of those stupid-ass power bricks. So really quite cool that this thing existed. So that's the short version of that story. There's more detailed explanations of what the Satellaview box was, or Satellaview. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it the right way, man. Like, it's so new to me. But a couple other things, like we got, of course, controllers here. This is the Super Famicom controller and the Super Nintendo controller. Now, they're essentially the same. There's only, other than the cosmetic differences with the colors and everything, and the plastic being a slightly different color, I noticed that the Super Nintendo controller, at least the North American one, has somewhat textured buttons. The Y and X buttons kind of are concave, whereas all of the buttons on Super Famicom controller are convex. Now, a lot of people prefer the aesthetics of this controller, but the cord length of this one, this is a very short cord. So what a lot of people do is get both, and then basically put the guts of a Super Nintendo controller inside the case of a Super Famicom controller, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. So yeah, that's very doable. It's super easy, so I just thought I'd let you guys know. The console itself is very, very nice. Supports RGB, at least this version does. The small version does not, unless it's been modified. Looks beautiful. Funny enough, the N64 didn't support RGB. They actually stripped it out. Now I'd like to take some time to talk about my personal experience with this console. The Super Nintendo is the first video game console I ever played in my entire life. The way that happened, I actually still remember this moment. It might be it's one of my earliest memories. I was at my cousin's house, and it must have been 1991, probably Thanksgiving of 1991, and I would have been like 5 years old. And they had gotten the Super Nintendo, I think, earlier that summer, because I'm pretty sure it came out in summer of '91. And they had Super Mario World playing. And for whatever reason, they just handed me the controller and said, "You go ahead and play." And I was playing the first level of Super Mario World, and I died a million times on that first red turtle. Like, I was a 5-year-old. That was terrible. I'd never played a video game before in my life, but I knew coming out of there, I was like, I need one of these. I just needed a video game console. And so I kept bugging my mom forever, as I said in the Genesis video. As I said then, she gave me an Atari 2600 to kind of hold me over for a bit, and eventually she gave me a Sega Genesis on Christmas. To this day, I don't really know why she picked a Genesis over an SNES. I tried to ask her about that, and she was like, "What are you even talking about?" She had no memory of what the hell I was even saying. So I don't really know why one came over the other. But I enjoyed the Genesis for about a year, and I kept begging, like, Super Nintendo, Because, see, the thing is, for every person I knew who had a Genesis, I knew a person with an SNES. And I thought they were both great game consoles. I didn't get why people were arguing with each other, saying what was better. I was like, dude, they're both awesome. Let's all enjoy them. And I stand by that. They're both amazing video game consoles that everyone should enjoy. So eventually, I managed to earn enough money myself, and I went ahead and I bought a Super Nintendo. And it was great. It was so much fun. I got so many games for it, and I had such a great time playing it. And really, that's like the short version. That's really how it happened, is I just really liked it. A lot of people had it, and I thought, I want one. I earned up a bunch of money doing this and that, and I eventually got one, and it was great. I think this is actually that exact same one. I never got rid of it. It's either this one or the one I've hooked up. I'm pretty sure it's this one. It's my original Super Nintendo. Very good game console. And it wasn't until years later that I even knew about the Super Famicom or the European Super Nintendo, that they look different. So I eventually imported those later. Super Nintendo Junior, I eventually, of all places, I found it at GameStop in like 2002. And I was like, what the hell? I picked that up. I do want to show you this. This is a Super Famicom game. Now you can see the shape of the cartridge is vastly different than what we had in North America. And of course, if you're in Europe, this looks very familiar to you because they were the same shape. I mean, they fit in just like that, or just like that. Now the difference is that this will work on a Super Famicom, obviously, but will not work on a European Super Nintendo, even though it will fit. It will work on an American Super Nintendo. However, there are little plastic bits back there that must be removed. And if you do that, this will fit in and it will work. The same goes for an American Super Nintendo game on the Super Famicom. It will work, you just have to physically get it in there. You could either cut the case, don't do that, or you could get one of these. This is a little adapter that will fit in either of these devices and allow you to play games from either region. Unfortunately, sorry PAL regions, this will fit, but it won't do anything for you. Don't blame me, I'm not Nintendo, I didn't design it. But one of the other things they did that was really cool, and I still can't believe, with all the insanity that came out of Sega, that they never did this. Nintendo released the Super Game Boy. Now, of course, goes in your Super Nintendo and gives you instant access, if you have an original Game Boy library, to play them on your Super Nintendo. This was fucking mind-blowing when I was a kid. I was like, my Game Boy games, I can play them on my TV? What? Like, that was crazy. How Sega never put this out for the Genesis with a Game Gear adapter? Like, I don't get. The Game Gear was essentially a Sega Master System. The Genesis had full Master System backwards compatibility. Duh, but they never did it. Sega, I love them, but you did some dumbass shit. But anyway, so Nintendo did do this, and we got to enjoy that. Unfortunately, not compatible with Game Boy Color or obviously Game Boy Advance games, but nevertheless, very cool device. And now I want to talk about some of the games that I had, or still have, obviously. Not all of them, obviously. I got more than this, but I've just shown you some highlights for one reason or another. Now, the first one up here is Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. And of course, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I'm sure you saw the other videos, hopefully on the Genesis and the Sega CD. I like Power Rangers, or I did a lot in the early 90s. And these are both really good games. I think they actually held up a lot better than the Genesis ones, to be honest with you. I like this one more, the regular game, as opposed to the movie game. I found this one to be a little too difficult. It's also really apparent that they meant to give you the Green Ranger. I think what happened was that this was a game based on Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Season 2 initially, and then they knew that movie was coming out. They were like, well, fuck it, just make him the White Ranger and put Ivan Ooze at the end of it, and there you go, that's our movie game. Because it has nothing to do with the movie. But either way, it was a fun game. I also got Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Fighting Edition, which was a cool fighting game where you use the Zords and they fight each other, and then you can fight some of the monsters and stuff. Really pretty cool game. Now, I live in Chicago, grew up in Chicago, huge Chicago Bulls fan, and of course, when one thinks of the Chicago Bulls, one immediately concludes Michael Jordan. And at the height of his popularity, he got a Super Nintendo game. One of the weirdest ones I've ever played. This is a platformer where you play as Michael Jordan. Now the game starts off, he's just practicing in like a facility, just shooting hoops, whatever. And then all of a sudden, he hears that like a bunch of NBA players have been captured, and they're like, you know, locked up in various places. They've been captured by like a sadistic circus clown or something to that effect. And you have to go free them. So what you do is you're going around and you're attacking like monsters with basketballs and stuff. It's so bizarre, but it's a lot of fun because it's just so bizarre. But yeah, it's called Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City. Of course, Windy City is one of the nicknames for Chicago, where I live. I've got Doom. Now, truth be told, I don't really care much about Doom. But this game is interesting because it's a cartridge that's kind of sought after, but not because people want the game, but because of the parts that are in it. A lot of those games I mentioned for the Satellaview have, like I said, they leaked onto the internet, and you can make reproduction carts of them, but some of them, particularly like F-Zero and Star Fox 2, which was not on this, but Star Fox 2 did get leaked onto the internet, can be put onto real cartridges, but they require an FX chip. Hello, Doom. You can fulfill that role. I think it uses FX2, which is why it's the most sought after for that reason, and that's how you can get physical copies of those games if you really want to. You basically have to sacrifice a copy of Doom. Now, obviously I didn't do that, but it's worth noting. And of course the game Star Fox, which I was just talking about somewhat. This game was revolutionary visually because it used the FX chip, which was something Nintendo came up with to, again, kind of one-up over Sega, saying like, hey, look, you know, our games can look like this, which, yes and no. the system itself couldn't quite do that. It needed extra chips, but you know, you're not going to really know that. You're not going to care. So ultimately, yeah, the Super Nintendo did do it, but it's funny how that kind of came to be. Truth told, though, on this game, I don't like it. I don't think it's a very good game. I didn't enjoy it at all. I love Star Fox 64. I love some of the other Star Fox stuff. I didn't enjoy this game. I just didn't. It was also known as STARWING in Europe, in case you're kind of confused. It was a trademark issue with the term Star Fox. It couldn't be brought over to Europe or Australia. But yeah, there you go, Star Fox. Toy Story. I liked this game a lot. It was a really cool platformer. This was a huge era of platformers. I mean, they were like the first-person shooters of the day. Like, there was so many damn platformers, and that's one of my favorite genres, which is probably another reason I really like this generation a lot. And I thought this was a pretty good one. It was, again, an era where movie-licensed games could be good. Although this one was made by Disney Interactive. At that point, I guess, I don't know this, I'm just speculating, because this game is basically the same version as the Genesis. So I'm thinking that since Sega made Aladdin and Capcom made Aladdin for the SNES, I'm thinking at one point Disney Interactive, basically Disney decided to make their own game studio and just start making multiplats. I think that's what happened. Either way, they made a good one. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. Also a very good game that I think a lot of you are very familiar with. This is an example where the multiplat ended up being better on the Super Nintendo than it did on the Genesis. The Genesis got Hyperstone Heist. Now I talked about that in my Genesis video, but I'm going to actually have to be brutally honest, like I was there. I know this is considered the better game, but in all honesty, I did prefer Hyperstone Heist. Sorry. And now, some games I think a lot of you are going to be familiar with, so some of them I won't talk as much about. Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. I think every single one of you knows about this game, but if I didn't bring it up, a bunch of you would have been like, what the hell? No Link to the Past? So, there you go. I would have brought up Super Metroid, but unfortunately I don't actually own it. I know, sorry. Hey, I had to put the budget into something, I put it into that. Just so you guys could see it. Super Mario Kart. Now, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this game. I love the series. I've liked every console edition of Mario Kart. I think Mario Kart 8 is my favorite. It used to be Mario Kart 64. But this one, I didn't really like. You know, my cousins used to play this game a lot, and I never got it. I never thought it was a particularly good game. It's not terrible. I've played way worse shit. But if you ever ask me like, hey, let's go play let's play Mario Kart, this is never going to be the one I suggest. I'm sorry. It's just, but it's still a good game. It just never really appealed to me. But nevertheless, it's very cool to have. Now, the masterpiece, as far as I'm concerned, one of the games I spent the most time with ever in my life. Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. This is an incredibly cool release for a lot of reasons. This is, you get a lot of bang for your buck with this one. So Super Mario World, like I said, was the first game I ever played. And I believe it must have been a launch title or very early on, because my cousins had it back in '91. And to that game specifically, I have played all the way through a fuck ton of times. I've beaten every aspect of it, all the secrets, not just the main course, but like all the side stuff. I've done it a lot. Love that game. But Nintendo seemed to have a little bit of a problem getting more Mario games out. So one of the things they did was this release, where they took all of the NES games and they basically remastered them in 16 bits. If you can think of that jump as a remaster, it was. And they did that, and they released that as its own separate title, just called Super Mario All-Stars. And then eventually they took both of those things and put them together to give you this. Now so what this game actually is like a collection of like 5 different Mario games. It's definitely one to pick up if you're looking into the Super Nintendo. And it contains one of my favorite games of all time, Super Mario World. It's an amazing game. Now I wasn't the only one that felt that way. Super Mario World was amazing. And I had a friend who lived down the street who had a Super Nintendo. And I would go over to his house all the time before I got mine, and we would play it there. Like I said, Mario games, though, oddly weren't coming out. Like, he got a lot of spin-offs, like Mario Paint and, you know, stuff like that. But, you know, until you got I think it was like a Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, which came out much later in the Super Nintendo lifespan, you know, there was kind of a dry spell there, which is why I think that release that I was talking about came out. But at one point, I remember his birthday was coming up, and I was in, it must have been like Best Buy or something, and I saw another game, a new Mario game, and I was like, oh my god, a new Mario game. I have to get him that. So I was like, I'm going to spend my money, at that age, by the way, I must have been like 6 or 7 at that point, maybe 8 at the most, and I was like, I'm gonna spend my money, I'm going to buy my friend a birthday gift for him, and then of course I will be able to go over to his house and play it, because that's part of why you'd be willing to do something like that at that age. And that game was Mario is Missing. I was missing my money after we played this one. I mean, the thing is, this is an educational game. I can't even express the amount of disappointment that was on our faces at the same time when we popped this and we were like, yeah, Mario, oh yes! And we started playing, we were like, what the fuck is this shit? Ah, can we return this? No, it's open. Damn it! Like, we were so upset, both of us, because he thought he was getting this great new Mario game that he was going to play all the time, and I thought, essentially, I'm getting this great new Mario game that I can play all the time. And we both got just massive, crushing disappointment. I mean, as an adult, it's a better game, but as a kid, this is so not what you want to play. I mean, if you've ever played it, the basic premise is Mario is missing, and you play as Luigi, and you have to go to real parts of the world, like France and Italy and all sorts of other fucking places. And you have to, like, solve crimes through, like, history crimes. You know, you'll find a little relic somewhere and you have to travel in time to another place and, like, deliver it to that part of history. So bad. So bad when you're a kid. You do not want to play this shit. But a game you do want to play, and then what we're going to go out on here, is Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy Kong's Quest. Other than Super Mario World, this was like the game I played on the Super Nintendo. Oddly, I didn't really like the first one. It's not bad, I've played it since, it just didn't captivate me. The third one didn't really do it for me either, but this one, oh my god, I could stop making this video and just go play this instead. Like, fuck this video, let's do that. Like, this is such an amazing game. I love it so much. And like Super Mario World, I know all the details. Like, I've been to every part of that game, I've done all the levels, even the super hard, like, crocodile zone that, like, has those secret, like, missions. Such an amazing gaming experience right here. I loved it so much. So, yeah, if you do get a Super Nintendo, I assume a lot of you already have one, but this is a definite must-have. It's an amazing video game console! It's my third favorite of all time, only slightly beaten by the Genesis, and then, of course, the Sega Dreamcast, which holds a special place in my heart forever. But yeah, as I said at the end of the Genesis video, because I know there's still people that debate which is better. Dude, fuck the debate. Just go play the damn consoles. They're both amazing. There's no reason to deprive yourself of one as opposed to the other. Unfortunately, Super Nintendos are a lot more valuable than they have been a few years ago. I think that has to do with, of course, you know, a lot of us who were kids when these came out wanting to go back and get them. But unlike the Genesis, where Sega put it, you know, everywhere, there was so many Genesis units out there. Super Nintendos, they didn't make as many of, and unfortunately because of the whole bromine issue, you know, the thing where it turns yellow and becomes brittle and breaks down, which I did a video about a long time ago. If your Super Nintendo's yellow, that is fixable. I'll link it there. Go ahead, click on it. But the problem with that is that a lot of units were basically destroyed over time. So they're a little bit more sought after, but I would never suggest a clone console, but I do know those exist. You know, another contributing factor is no doubt the cases. I mean, you know, Super Nintendo games came in those stupid paper cases, whereas Sega Genesis stuff came in plastic clamshell cases. I know that sounds dumb, but if you really think about it, I remember as a kid, if I had a Sega Genesis game, I was like, oh sweet, you know, it's protected in this hard plastic case, I can easily open it, get to the game, close it back up. It made sense. Super Nintendo games were flimsy paper and they were harder to get into, and unfortunately what happened is a lot of people threw those out, and as a result, they're just much more sought after, I think. Not to mention, of course, that Nintendo IPs, man, Nintendo was so good at brand marketing. You go ask anybody who's into video games, they could probably list at least like 10 games on the Super Nintendo. Granted, it's probably a lot more of the typical stuff, like, you know, Metroid, Mario, Zelda, etc. But you ask them the same thing about the Genesis. Even though Sega always matched it a one-for-one in great gaming experiences, most people will just be like, Sonic, because that's all really anybody knows about the Genesis. But yeah, in general, Super Nintendo stuff is more expensive than it used to be, but there's any number of ways to experience the Super Nintendo if you really want to. All I'm saying is, love them both. There's no reason to deprive yourself of one if you have the other. Get them both if you can. They're both amazing video game experiences. So yeah, that's it for the Super Nintendo, I think. And thank you guys for watching, and please stay tuned to part 7, which will be on the SNK Neo Geo AES. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all later.